So now the large intestine is the terminal part of the alimentary canal. The primary function of this organ is to absorb nutrients and water, synthesize certain vitamins, form feces, and then get rid of those feces, eliminate them. The large intestine runs from the appendix to the anus, and so you can see this appendix is an extension of the cecum here, and it goes all the way through to the anus. And despite it being about 1/2 the size of the small intestine, it is called large because it is twice the diameter. The large intestine is divided into 4 different regions, which you don't need to know for lecture, but you do need to know for lab. The cecum is the entry point, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then there's also the sigmoid colon. But the large intestine in general is subdivided into 4 different regions. We have the cecum, this colon here, and then the rectum, which is kind of like the area going into the anal canal, and then we have the anus. The ileocecal valve is located at the opening of the ileum into the cecum, controlling the flow of chyme from that small intestine to the large intestine. The first part of the large intestine is the cecum, and it receives contents from the ileum and continuous absorption of water and salts. Attached to the cecum is the appendix, which contains lymph tissue, suggesting it has an immunological function. The cecum then blends seamlessly into the colon, which is then divided into those 4 regions I mentioned, the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon is kind of the hardest to identify. Just know it as right after the descending colon, and it kind of has this curvature going on before it gets to the anus. So that's the sigmoid colon. Some functions of the large intestine: we have secretion, absorption, and defecation. And since the histology of the large intestine is quite similar to the small intestine, I'm not going to go into much detail other than that the mucosa is much more specialized for secreting mucus and absorbing water. Also worth noting is the production of vitamin K and B5 by the bacterial microflora in the large intestine. This microflora is part of the microbiome in your hindgut that you feed with certain aspects of your diet known as prebiotics, and they produce something that is beneficial for you, vitamins K and B5. So in the large intestine, mechanical digestion begins when chyme moves from the ileum into the cecum, an activity regulated by the ileocecal sphincter. Ileocecal sphincter. Right after you eat, peristalsis in the ileum forces chyme into the cecum. When the cecum is distended with chyme, contractions of the ileocecal sphincter strengthen. And once chyme enters the cecum, colon movements begin. One type of peristalsis in the large intestine is slower than in the more proximal portions of the alimentary canal. This is called a mass movement. These strong waves start midway through the transverse colon and quickly force the contents toward the rectum. Mass movements usually occur 3 or 4 times a day, either while you eat or immediately afterward. Stretching in the stomach and the breakdown products of digestion in the small intestine provoke the gastrocolic reflex, which increases movement or motility, including this mass movement in the colon. Fiber in the diet also softens the stool and increases the power of colonic contractions, optimizing activities of the colon, which is why you should include lots of fiber in your diet. That's what we evolved to eat. Although the glands of the large intestine secrete mucus, they do not secrete digestive enzymes. Therefore, chemical digestion in the large intestine occurs exclusively because bacteria in the lumen of the colon. Through the process of saccharolytic fermentation, bacteria break down some of the remaining carbohydrates, and this results in the discharge of hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane gas, and this creates a flatus, or gas, in the colon. Flatulence is excessive flatus. Each day, up to 1,500 milliliters of flatus is produced in the colon, and more is produced when you eat foods such as beans, which are rich in otherwise indigestible sugars and complex carbohydrates like soluble dietary fiber. The process of defecation begins when mass movements force feces from the colon into the rectum, stretching that rectum wall and provoking the defecation reflex, eliminating feces. This is a parasympathetic reflex mediated by the spinal cord. Contracts the sigmoid colon and rectum, relaxing the internal anal sphincter and initially contracting the external anal sphincter. The presence of the feces in the anal canal sends a signal to your brain, which gives you the choice of voluntarily opening the external anal sphincter, which allows you to defecate, or you can keep it temporarily closed. If you decide to delay this defecation, it takes a few seconds for the reflex contractions to stop and the rectal walls relax. The next mass movement will trigger additional defecation reflexes until you defecate. So now the small intestine absorbs about 90% of the water that you ingest, either as liquid or within solid food. The large intestine absorbs most of the remaining water, and a process that converts the liquid chyme residue into semi-solid feces, or stool. Feces is composed of undigested food residue, unabsorbed digested substances, millions of bacteria, old epithelial cells from the GI or gastrointestinal mucosa, just get sloughed off, inorganic salts, and enough water to let it pass smoothly out of the body. Of every 500 milliliters of food residue that enters the cecum each day, about 150 milliliters become feces, so about a third become feces. So now that we're done talking about the alimentary canal, we can talk about the accessory organs and how they contribute. These accessory organs are not part of this alimentary canal, like I said, so food does not pass directly through them. They are instead involved only in chemical digestion when we're talking about digestion. No mechanical or peristalsis or ingestion or defecation, just in chemical digestion. The liver and pancreas have functions outside of digestion that we're not going to talk about extensively. The gallbladder is simply a storage spot for bile. So starting with the liver, it helps break down and recycle our red blood cells as well as iron. It has a production and secretion of bile mechanism that allows emulsification of fat, helps with detoxification, which is why if you drink too much, you can really harm your liver. It also synthesizes plasma proteins and clotting factors that are essential, and it also is involved in glycogen storage. Pancreas and the liver react to each other, so if the pancreas releases glucagon, a hormone, this will stimulate the liver to break down glycogen and then release glucose then when reserves in the blood are too low. The gallbladder stores and concentrates bile and releases bile into the duodenum. The common bile duct is what actually combines from the liver and the gallbladder to release its bile into the duodenum. This common bile duct is also going to be joined by this pancreatic duct from the pancreas. This pancreas has endocrine and exocrine functions. Exocrine just simply means that it's releasing its enzyme or whatever into a duct and then the target organ. So we have a duct here. It'll be releasing it into the organ. Endocrine just means it's secreting it directly into the bloodstream. So you won't see it on this slide, but on the next slide you can see a version of endocrine. So the exocrine functions of the pancreas are related to the chemical digestion. This was producing and secreting pancreatic juices into the duodenum. All right, so it joins this common bile duct and then releases its enzymes into the duodenum of the small intestine. Bicarbonate is among those, helping reduce acidity of the stomach acid. And there's also enzymes that are assisting in the digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Endocrine functions of the pancreas are going to, as you can see, release their hormones directly into the bloodstream. We'll talk about this more when we get to the endocrine system, but what you need to know is that it's producing and secreting hormones directly into the bloodstream, not through a duct. So exocrine, there's a duct involved. Endocrine, there is not a duct involved. And this is going to be insulin and glucagon regulating glucose levels in the bloodstream. When it comes to what you need to eat on a regular basis, there are 6 main categories. Water is among them, and there are not examples of that because it's just water. Protein, so make sure you get your nuts. Legumes, mushrooms, vegetables have a decent amount of protein, you'd be surprised. Brussels sprouts are high in protein as a vegetable. And then meat, of course, has some protein. Lots of protein in meat. Just comes along with a lot of baggage, so you don't want to eat meat for every meal. You want to make sure you have lots of the other options for protein consumption, and then supplement with meat rather infrequently, because that's what our bodies evolved to do. Our bodies did not evolve to eat meat on a regular basis. Carbohydrates, we need starch and sugar, and then lipids, we need fats and oils. When it comes to micronutrients, these are things that are involved in different transport mechanisms in cells, such as calcium, potassium, and sodium. Iron is involved in hemoglobin transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so all these different minerals you can acquire from your food, as well as zinc and other ones. And then vitamins that are essential for different bodily functions and cellular activity, such as vitamin D, contributing to our absorption of calcium. We also need our A's and B's, like B12 for mood, and B5 for cellular activities, vitamin C so that we don't get scurvy, vitamin K so that we can clot blood when we get a cut. We need all these vitamins, and we can acquire most of them through our food. You can basically acquire every vitamin besides B12 through vegetables. B12 is a difficult one to acquire through vegetables. It would only be found on like the soil or the dirt of like root vegetables because of the bacteria that are in the dirt. For the most part, you'll find B12 in meat, or you can supplement with that. When it comes to the different summary slides that I like to do at the end, I'm going to have mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, and absorption as summaries, so that you can use these as general guides for studying. But of course, all these processes are much more in depth as we just covered them. So these will be good frameworks for guiding you through your studies. So for when it comes to mechanical digestion, we have 4 different regions of the body that are involved. The mouth with mastication, the esophagus with peristalsis, the stomach with churning, intestines with segmentation, peristalsis, and then chemical digestion, we have the mouth, stomach, small intestine, pancreas, and the liver and gall bladder. The mouth releases salivary amylase to digest carbs. The stomach releases pepsin to digest proteins and lipase to digest lipids. The small intestine releases intestinal juice that help digest our proteins and carbs. The pancreas releases its own juice, helping us digest all the major macronutrients. And the liver and gallbladder help release that bile so we can break down lipids, which are large and difficult to absorb in the epithelial cells that are lined with water as well. So we have to break them down into smaller nonpolar substances so that they can diffuse across those cell walls. And absorption occurs in 3 main places, mostly in the small intestine, which is why all those macronutrients, their derivatives are involved here. So glucose from a starch, amino acids from proteins, fats from lipids. The stomach does absorb alcohol and aspirin, which is why the effects of alcohol are so quick. And then large intestine is involved in producing the B12 and K, and then also subsequently absorbing those, as well as B5, and then water. But other than that, that is the end of digestion.